Today I want to explore a little bit of the world of military doctrine, specifically that of the Royal Navy, Royal Air Force and British Army that make up the British Armed Forces. Now there are going to be elements of this video that are part of the cadet syllabus, specifically the tactical principles we'll look at in the second half. But really looking at doctrine is more of an interest topic, it's a military knowledge topic, and the reason why I want to talk about it is because I think that there are parts of this and the philosophy surrounding it that are relevant for all walks of life, and actually it's just good wisdom and good knowledge that you can take with you whatever you end up doing with your life. And certainly some of the ideas that we're going to discuss today could be applied to any different kind of organization, whether it be a school, a company, a big business, a bank, whatever it is. There's value in what we're going to look at today. So we're going to look at two basic introductory aspects of the doctrine of the British Armed Forces. One is the concept of fighting power, and the other is the concept of tactical principles. So throughout the video, think not just in military terms, but think about the wider world too. Think about how you could apply this to other organizations or apply this to your own lives. I'm going to speak from a military perspective, but really try and think about what the wider wisdoms are here and how we might use these ideas to better ourselves in non-military contexts too. So open your mind up, sit back, relax, and let's look at some doctrine. The first question is, what is fighting power? The simple answer is that fighting power is the operational effectiveness of armed forces. In other words, it's a good way to judge how effective a military is. Operational effectiveness meaning essentially how competent they are at war. So fighting power is how good they are, how powerful they are. And this diagram on the right is really how we understand this model of fighting power, what it consists of. As you can see, there are three main components, all interlinking. There's the conceptual component, which is like the brain of the armed forces or the brain of the organization. There's the moral component, which is like the heart of the organization. And there's the physical component, which is like the body of the organization. And these three core components exist within, of course, a wider context, which is everything outside of that organization. And I'm going to look at each of the components in detail so we can think about what makes a strong or weak conceptual, moral or physical component and how they interact with the context that they're in. We'll start with the conceptual component then, the brain. And this really is the intellectual basis of fighting power, guiding the other aspects. It's our knowledge, understanding and application of doctrine. So it's all about how we think and what we think, both of which are manifested in doctrine. Doctrine, of course, is a set of fundamental principles by which military forces guide their actions. In other words, it's the ideas behind how we operate, how we work, how we fight, the ideas behind the decisions we make. So the conceptual component here is like the DNA, the code, the instruction manual of this machine. And it's incredibly important because it provides the mental agility, the intellectual rigor, and the creativity required to be effective and to win wars. And we have doctrine basically so that people know what to do and how to act. And they also know how to work out how to act, so that we're not making things up as we go along. As Carl von Clausewitz explains, theory exists so that one does not have to start afresh every time. It is meant to educate the future commander. If we have good theoretical knowledge and good understanding, then we're in the right position to make the right decisions later on. So a military with a strong conceptual component will have good knowledge and understanding. And that might come from the wisdom of the past. It's why you are required to learn military history at Sandhurst. It's why good officers engage in learning about psychology and philosophy and history. Indeed, the great generals of history have also often been philosophers, thinkers, writers, and they will have learned history in their upbringing. But it's not just about having knowledge. A military with a strong conceptual component also needs to understand and interpret that knowledge correctly. You need commanders who are perceptive, who have good insight, and who can't just recite battles of history, but perhaps can explain the lessons learned from them, or can explain and analyze great commanders of the past. What made them great, and what made these commanders not so great. You also need modern, relevant knowledge, perhaps lessons learnt from recent campaigns or events, things that you can apply to the 21st century. And if you have this strong foundation of knowledge and understanding, then you're in a better position to make the right decisions. You aren't going to make mistakes that have been made in the past. Well, you might, but at least you can avoid them. And you're going to use the collective wisdom of thousands of years of human warfare to help guide your actions and guide your decisions. After all, knowledge is power. Of course, that knowledge and understanding then needs to be applied. A military with a strong conceptual component of their fighting power will have used that knowledge and understanding to create its own doctrine. This is how we're going to do it. And there are two basic forms of doctrine. There's higher level, which is all about philosophy and principles. And then there's lower level doctrine, which outlines the kind of practices and procedures. So doctrine encompasses a lot, right, from the high level down to the lower level. It also needs to be flexible, as does this whole conceptual component. And this is really key because one of the common mistakes made by military commanders, and indeed all leaders or commanders, people in positions of power or authority, one of the common mistakes they make all through history is stubbornness. It's being unwilling to adapt, to change, to embrace new ideas, unwilling to throw their previous ideas or opinions out the window and to review their own opinions. So effective doctrine needs to be constantly reviewed, constantly critiqued, thought about, and changed wherever necessary. And that's why the British Army updates its doctrine all the time. It creates new doctrines as well, such as the cyber warfare doctrine or a new JDP on unmanned aerial vehicles, things that keep them up to date with the times, new ideas, fresh ideas, as well as always reviewing the old. A military that is flexible and open to new ideas is going to have a strong conceptual component. To achieve that, you need to have the right command in place. You need a command that has the right cognitive skills. You need intelligent, knowledgeable people making doctrine, people who are perceptive and have good insight. But you also need a command and a leadership that is open to new ideas, that is reflective, that does continuously think about what they're doing, whether they could do it better. And that's so important in leadership, and it's so important in any organization, keeping an open mind and being willing to learn from your mistakes. And the best way to achieve these things is to do stuff. It's to make mistakes, learn lessons from them, and constantly try to improve. That's why even in peacetime, the military is constantly putting its doctrine into practice in exercises and drills. It's why NATO regularly holds war games, testing out its ideas, strategies, and tactics, and finding out what works, what doesn't work, and then making changes. So you need to have a military that is intellectually active, it's discussing with itself, it's reviewing what it's doing all the time, it's reviewing its doctrine, it's not afraid of making mistakes, it's not afraid of doing things and getting them wrong and learning from them, and that's important in organizations as well. It's also why training and education is so important. Most militaries around the world these days ensure their soldiers are educated to the same degree. The British Army has an education element within it, and soldiers are taught maths, English, science. These intellectual pursuits, of course, are just as important as military training because they ensure that soldiers are able to process information, they can analyze, they can think carefully, they can weigh up ideas, and therefore they can make the right decisions. So this conceptual element, component of a military's fighting power, its brain, is really important. So that's the conceptual component, the brain of the organization. And the next to consider is the moral component, which I like to think of as the heart of the organization. The moral component is the human aspect of fighting power, and it really consists of three things: morale, leadership, and ethics, morality, and law. You need all three of these things, and you need them working together in order to get a strong moral component. And the moral component is easily corrupted. Humans aren't perfect, and this is especially important in a military organization that is capable or is meant to use violence to achieve its aims. So in a functioning liberal democracy like we have in this country, we need to have a good founding of ethics, morality, and law. We need to have strong leadership, good role models, and we need to, all importantly, have high level of morale. And I'll start by looking at this, because in the words of General George C. Marshall, who was the Chief of Staff of the US Army during World War II and a very intelligent general, morale is a state of mind. It is steadfastness and courage and hope. It is confidence and zeal and loyalty. It is élan, spirit de corps, and determination. It is staying power, the spirit which endures to the end, the will to win. With it, all things are possible. Without it, everything else, planning, preparation, production count for naught. And what he's saying there is morality is really the heart of this. If you can have the most perfect equipment, all the great training, if you don't want to fight, if you don't want to compete, it's not going to work. And you will know this feeling if you play in sports teams or if you've been in any kind of organized competitive team. You'll know what it feels like to have low morale, that moment when you've just conceded a second goal, you're 2-0 down, and there's not much time left. Your morale drops every time that happens. And so it's really key that we keep morale high. Well, how do we do that? Of the many contributory factors to morale, which include, of course, the Army's values and standards, the Sea Drills life, which I'll come on to in a second, there are 7 key factors that really stand out, and they're described on this slide. And these factors are mutually supporting, and they're developed most effectively through good leadership and through challenging, realistic training. Let's look at them. The first is fighting spirit. And this really comprises of a lot of things. It means initiative, courage, resilience, determination, toughness. It's the mettle, the thing that drives soldiers forward in even the most arduous and adverse of conditions. Fighting spirit requires moral and physical fortitude. It requires people to be strong, to stick at it, to keep going. That moment, as I said, when you concede a goal in a game of football, if you have fighting spirit, then your reaction to conceding a goal is to lift your chin up and say, come on, let's go again, let's go at them, let's score. By testing fighting spirit in demanding training, it is hardened and made more resilient to the realities of potentially brutal and horrible conflict. Moral cohesion is the sense of shared identity and a determined purpose that gives the force a will to fight and succeed. This cohesion that binds individuals into teams. It turns a load of people who don't know each other, random people, turns them into a team who are all pulling in the same direction and all want to achieve the same thing. It makes forces emotionally resilient in adversity, and it also makes individuals more likely to use their initiative to exploit opportunities, gives them confidence, gives them spirit, because they feel that their comrades either side of them are behind them and will back them. Now, the nature of conflict puts significant pressure on moral cohesion, but without it, the force is susceptible to shock and collapse. It's leadership that gives a force moral cohesion, mostly by building shared identity and shared values. This is why regiments have their own traditions, their own badges and symbols, their own colours, their own uniforms that they wear at certain events. That's why those things exist. They bring people into this idea that they're part of a team, they're part of something collective, something bigger than them. And common experiences and histories strengthen that comradeship and pride. It's why if you're in a regiment, you learn about the regimental history, the battles fought, and you have that shared history. And together, these build identity, ethos, and cause, which individuals can value even above their own lives. That's moral cohesion. And discipline underpins those two things. It underpins fighting spirit and it underpins moral cohesion. It's the glue that holds soldiers together when they're threatened, and it's the primary antidote to fear. When discipline is sound, commanders can be confident that their orders will be carried out, and soldiers will know that their commanders and their comrades will not let them down. Commanders at all levels and all people involved are responsible for maintaining discipline in terms of obedience to the law, the regulations, the orders, instructions, procedures, and just obedience to the standards and the values. And as you know, the best discipline, the most powerful discipline is self-discipline. You need to instill that within yourself. You want, as a commander, you want your subordinates to want to do the right thing, to want to stick to the rules. And ultimately, that is the best form of discipline. And you want people who will do so with initiative and with intelligence. Comradeship is the basis of these things as well, and the wider morale of any force. Now, land conflict, any conflict, is ultimately a human activity conducted by groups of people whose comradeship gives them friendship and mutual trust. And this friendship and mutual trust is a very biological thing. It's hardwired into us, but it's necessary to endure and overcome danger, fear, and any kind of troubles. So in operations, that's why you have these comradeships form. People who live with each other, work with each other, fight with each other. They're going to stick by one another when hardship comes. And pride in oneself, one's unit, service, country and cause can also be a potent force for morale. Having a sense of achievement and pride inspires individuals and it inspires teams to the greatest heights of sacrifice and valor. It also generates a common goal of avoiding shame by doing the right thing, upholding the ethical foundation of the organization you're in and abiding by the values and standards. In other words, you don't want to let down your organization by not showing the right values, because you won't be proud of yourself and your organization won't be proud of you. So pride without arrogance brings people from the widest variety of backgrounds together and strengthens the ties of moral cohesion. Confidence and trust placed also in the equipment, in the people, in the ideas. Confidence there is key, and it's the sustainment of this confidence that is so important to morale. Your living conditions, the rations you eat, the ammunition, the amount you have available, the vehicles you're using, whether or not they work or if they're rubbish, the weapons you have, how good they are, communications, medical support, all these things underpin morale. The second you start losing those, the second you're in horrible living conditions, you're low on supplies, you're not getting communications, you feel out of the loop, the second you're in danger and you feel like you don't have that medical support, your morale is going to drop. So you need people to have confidence in what's going on. And finally, spirit. Field Marshal Slim concluded that only spiritual foundations can withstand real strain. Now, this idea traditionally would be religious. It would be the idea that you have Christianity in Britain as the core of your morale as a fighting unit. Nowadays, it could be cultural things or political things as well. Your spirit, if you were fighting for the Red Army in World War II, you would have that communist spirit about you, and that might be what really guided you. But essentially, it's a belief in something better. In Britain, that spirit might come from a genuine belief in liberal democracy, in freedom, in equal rights for people. And that might be the thing that you think really drives your morale. And if you have the right spirit, if you really believe in the cause, then your morale is going to be much higher than if you're fighting in a situation where you don't really think we're right. And that's why you had morale problems, for example, in Iraq and Afghanistan, where a lot of the soldiers, particularly US soldiers, started to doubt if what they were doing there was right, if it was legal, if it was a good thing to do, if they should be there in the first place. And that really affects morale. So you've got morale. What about leadership? Well, leadership is seen in the army as a combination of things. It's a combination of your character, it's a combination of your knowledge and of your action that inspires other people to achieve. And this is really a novel idea in a military sense in history. Traditionally, you might have had your great general, your Alexander the Great, or your Hannibal, or your Caesar, and they would be the leader, and everyone else below them is just kind of people. They just follow orders, do what you're told. But in the last 100 years or so, this new idea of having everyone be leaders. Everyone needs to know leadership. Everyone needs to show leadership. That's really key, particularly in modern warfare where it's not about numbers, it's about making the right decisions. So in modern warfare, you don't really have the cannon fodder like you would have had in the trenches of World War I or at the Battle of Waterloo. Instead, every soldier is expected to think for themselves and to act in the right way. So leadership, therefore, is the central element, in a way, of the moral component. It is so important to morale, and it's so important to upholding ethics and standards, that if you have poor leadership, it sticks out like a sore thumb. Anyone who's ever been in a team led by someone who was perhaps a bully, perhaps not willing to listen to other people, perhaps arrogant or stubborn, you'll know what it feels like to see bad leadership and how instantly that destroys your morale. So leadership is also not constrained to those in command. It's not constrained to those who have ranks. It includes private soldiers. Even private soldiers, the lowest ranks, the meat on the ground, even they can motivate people around them through initiative, example, and courage. In battle, it's leaders who break the paralysis of shock amid fear, certainty, death and destruction. It's those leaders who stand up in those moments and drive people forward, lead the line. They're the ones who matter. And their vision, their intellect, their communication, and their motivation of other people paves a path through chaos and confusion. They inspire other people through boldness, courage, personal example, compassion, resolute determination to win. And at all other times, it's leaders who shape and control the conduct of the force for good or for worse. Not least in the words of Lord Charles Wilson, 1st Baron Moran, who was the personal doctor to Winston Churchill in World War II. Character, as Aristotle taught, is a habit, the daily choice of right and wrong. It is a moral quality which grows to maturity in peace and is not suddenly developed on the outbreak of war. For war, in spite of what we have heard to the contrary, has no power to transform. It merely exaggerates the good and the evil that are in us, till it is plain for all to read. It cannot change, it exposes. And what he means by that is, if you want effective leadership in wartime, if you want effective leaders in times of difficulty, in times of poverty, in times of strife, then you need leaders who are always showing the right characteristics. You need people to be courageous in peacetime, people to make the right decisions in times of prosperity. That's just as important. And finally, the third aspect of the moral component of fighting power is ethics, morality, and law. To be effective, a force's actions must reflect a sound and appropriate ethical, moral, and legal foundation, and they have to be perceived as doing that by their audience, the people. If they're not, authority will be undermined, reducing, if not removing, the opportunity to translate tactical military success into desired political outcomes, which are ultimately what militaries are meant to do. And the actions of soldiers are guided by their obligations. They're guided by their values and standards, by their legal requirements as well, and their responsibilities as people who have been entrusted to defend the nation. British soldiers have responsibilities to their country and their comrades that aren't expected of the rest of us in society, because they place their right to life and liberty in the hands of the service of the nation. Right? They risk their lives and their liberty for a greater good, and they have to be prepared, therefore, to accept the risk of their own lives, and they have to be prepared to occasionally use lethal force. And to ensure they conduct themselves appropriately, they therefore must comply with the Army's values and standards. You know the values: siege drills, courage, discipline, respect, integrity, loyalty, selfless commitment. But the standards as well, which you may not know, are important to the professional soldier. They have to act lawfully. That means human rights laws, it means national laws, international laws of conflict. They have to act appropriately, and they have to use total professionalism at all times. And failure to do these things has really strict consequences if you're a British soldier. It's why the military has its own prison system, and it's something that the British Armed Forces take very seriously indeed. So it's those things, morale, leadership, and ethical, moral, and legal foundation, are what makes the moral component of a military's fighting power. If a military has low morale, poor leadership, or its authority is undermined by unethical, immoral, or illegal actions that call it into question, then it's significantly weakened as an effective force and as an organisation. The last key component of fighting power is the physical component. And this is the body of the organisation. It's its bones, skeleton, its muscles, its strength. It's actually what it has available in its arsenal. The physical component of fighting power provides the means to fight and consists of 5 things, commonly abbreviated to METSR: manpower, equipment, training, sustainability, and resources. If you don't have those things, none of the other components are going to work. You need manpower, people. That's why the British government have put so much effort recently into trying to improve their ability to attract, recruit, and retain the right people with the right skills. Currently, the British Army in particular is severely undermanned, and this is putting a real dent in the physical component of its fighting power, and therefore having a negative impact on its overall ability. And this pool of manpower consists not just of soldiers either, a regular reserve, but also of civil servants, of civilians, contractors, anyone who plays some role in the military. You also need equipment. You need equipment that's technologically up to date. You need equipment that works, that is maintained properly, and you need plenty of it. Training too. Training is essential. It's the essential vehicle by which all 3 components of fighting power are developed. That's how you get people to have the right moral component, the right physical component, and the right conceptual component. Sustainability is essential. Even if the force is fully manned and has all the necessary equipment and training, if it cannot be sustained, then it cannot be used as intended. It's not good enough to have the equipment. You need to be able to make more to replace the equipment that gets damaged or broken. And you need to be able to get that equipment to where it needs to be. That's why military logistics is often so complicated, and it's why commanders spend a lot of time thinking about equipment and logistics rather than thinking about fighting. Finally, the physical component is also reliant on wider resources. Ultimately, if there are insufficient resources available to recruit, train, equip, deploy, and sustain a force, then the physical component, and therefore your fighting power, is severely undermined. If your country simply cannot produce enough metal to make the equipment and the weapons that you need, then it doesn't matter how good your doctrine is, ultimately you're going to struggle. In the words of Field Marshal Archibald Wavell, who was a British military commander in the Black Watch from 1901 to 1943, in the Second World War, he was also Governor General of India. He said, "The more I see of war, the more I realize how it all depends on administration and transportation. It takes little skill or imagination to see where you would like your army to be and when. It takes much more knowledge and hard work to know where you can place your forces and whether you can maintain them there. And what he's saying there is actually the art of war, and this is something that's been said for millennia. A lot of it is about your logistics. It's about being able to put the right people in the right place. Simply the game of chess that is battle, that's kind of the easy bit. The hard bit is being able to get there in the first place. So there you have the three main components of fighting power, which you can use to judge the effectiveness of a military. You can imagine, for sake of argument, armed forces that are good on the physical component. They might have lots of resources, equipment, the latest technology. They might have a load of supplies, a load of money. But then they make the wrong decisions with their doctrine, or they make mistakes and they don't learn from them, or they do things that perhaps undermine their moral component, or they make decisions or are involved in incidents that call into question their ethical grounding. The armed forces of the United States in the past 20 years really comes to mind there as a good example. You could also imagine armed forces that have strong, well thought out doctrine and who work hard to ensure their moral component is also strong, but who lack the manpower or resources to really be effective in the way that they want to be. And sadly, the British Armed Forces come to mind there too. We have very strong doctrine, a very good culture within the organisation, but really lack the manpower and lack the resources to do what perhaps the British Armed Forces want to do. So these three components are very much interconnected, and it's worth considering how the components might also be applied to organisations like companies or businesses. If I was to use an example of a school, you'll see how this works. Now, a school needs a good conceptual component. It needs to know how to teach, all the theory and philosophy and psychology behind that. It needs to employ intelligent, knowledgeable people, and it needs to constantly be reflecting on its practice and making improvements where it can. That's the conceptual component. But a school also needs a strong moral component. It needs to have clear and fair rules for teachers, rules for pupils. It needs everyone to understand these rules and why they exist. It needs teachers to enforce them properly, and it needs leadership to enforce rules on teachers properly as well. It needs good leaders, it needs good role models to demonstrate the right kinds of character that you want to instill in the young people you're teaching. That's the moral component. And finally, a school also needs a strong physical component. It can have those two things, but if it doesn't have textbooks or classrooms, or it can't afford to pay teachers, it's not going to work. It's not going to be able to sustain what it does. So you can see how this idea can translate really well outside of the military world as well. It works with businesses, with anything. Now, the last aspect of fighting power we need to look at is this context in which those three components sit. Fighting power is in some respects a relative as well as an absolute concept. For example, certain forces may be assessed as having high fighting power, but be fundamentally unsuited for a specific task. What do I mean by that? I mean, you might have a massive military with clear doctrine, with the right moral component, good morale, good cohesion, good leadership, with all the equipment it needs, and they might spend all their time training how to operate in an urban environment, and then they find themselves invaded through a forest. Well, suddenly the rest of that doesn't really matter because they're not properly prepared. They're not fit for the environment. Likewise, if we wanted, we could train and create a very effective military organization based on perhaps the Roman army. We could do that this year. That'd be easy. But it would be pointless and it wouldn't be able to compete in the world. So those two ideas, relative and competitive, that's important. Your fighting power depends on your position against other militaries and their fighting power. The other thing that's important is the environment, and that means the actual physical environment, but it also means the political environment. It means the moral environment, what's going on in the world. You need to have a military that fits into that context. And the last aspect of the context is important is actors and interoperability. What does that mean? Well, it means that a good military needs to be able to work with other organizations effectively. So the UK is a member of NATO, so the British Army needs to be able to work closely with armies of other NATO allies. That's why NATO holds training exercises and tries those things out. And it's also why things like the NATO phonetic alphabet or MAP symbols, they're universal across NATO countries. But it's not just international actors or other nations you need to work with. You need your military to work well with other government agencies in your own country, such as the intelligence services or with the government. Again, you can have a very, very effective military, but if the government's really problematic and the government's weak and struggling, then you've got no direction, you've got no leadership, and that's when you end up with military coups and things like that, where the military is being used in the wrong kind of way. And again, Take this idea out of the military context and it stands. A business needs not just to have its own strong conceptual, moral and physical components, but it needs to be suited to the context it's in. You could have a really, really good air conditioning business, but if you set up shop in Antarctica, you're not going to sell anything. So there we have it. That is fighting power, the operational effectiveness of armed forces. The second question I want to answer concerns tactical principles. Now, these are often known as the principles of war, and it's important to note that different militaries, different countries through history and across the world have variations on these, and it depends on their approach or their culture. It depends on the conclusions they've reached based on their own experiences or on their histories. The first man, there's Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War sometime in the 5th century BC. He provided one of the earliest examples of a set of tactical principles. The Art of War outlines some principles that help you win wars. That's the point. It tells you what's important, what you need to do, how you need to think, what you need to prioritize. And this idea has existed beyond that. And since that, there have been all kinds of different machinations. Niccolo Machiavelli, Karl von Clausewitz, Leo VI the Wise of Byzantine Empire. There have been many examples of rulers, philosophers, writers who have come up with a set of principles for winning wars. But I'm going to look at the modern 21st century British Armed Forces tactical principles. There are 10. These 10 tactical principles are taught to all officers of the Royal Navy, the British Army and the Royal Air Force. And they're explained as providing a foundation for all military activity and for explaining that the relative importance of each one depends according to the context and that their application requires judgment, common sense and intelligent interpretation. In other words, these principles help you win wars, but they're just a basic set of principles. You need to think a lot more about them rather than just know them. Nonetheless, I'm going to whiz through these. Now, these are part of the cadet syllabus and worth writing down and knowing. The first is selection and maintenance of the aim. And this is often known as the master principle of war. It states that a single, unambiguous aim is the keystone of successful military operations. In other words, every military operation needs to have a clear mission, a clear intent that you've selected carefully, everyone understands, and you maintain. It has to be clear, it has to be direct, it has to be attainable with what you have available, and it needs to be adhered to throughout. In other words, you couldn't have an aim which is, we are going to win a war. It's too vague. You want specific aims, specific goals, specific missions. You want each of your units, each of your component parts of your military to know what their mission is and to stick to that mission. Second is maintenance of morale. Now, I've already mentioned how important morale is, but it's in the tactical principles as well. It's essential to maintain good morale to ensure your forces are able to achieve their aims. And this is something that's been known about for millennia, and yet people still struggle to do it, still get it wrong. Third, offensive action. Again, something that's been known for millennia. That idea of seizing the momentum, seizing the initiative, having the tempo and putting the enemy on the back foot, that is key to warfare. You want to be the military that's making the decisions about the battlefield. If you find yourself in a battle where you're reacting to what the enemy's doing all the time, then you're not in control, you're reactive. That's not a good situation to be in. So the third principle is offensive action. The fourth, surprise, the element of surprise. Now the consequence, this is what surprise is. Surprise is the consequence of shock and confusion resulting from the introduction of the unexpected. Now, how do we use the element of surprise? Well, it depends on how we collect information, how we exploit that information. So we need to know things in order to launch surprise attacks, or to take the enemy by surprise. It also requires good skills and drills. You need to be able to adapt quickly, to take advantage of situations. You need to be able to be in control. If you've got a military unit that is pretty rubbish at fire and maneuver, then their ambushes might not work. If you've got a military unit that is rubbish at shooting, then they've got no chance of springing an effective ambush because they're going to miss the target all the time. So skills and drills are key. 5, concentration of force. Now, this is also known as defeat in detail, and the idea behind this is that you put superior fighting power when and where it's needed. Now, one of the masters at this was Napoleon in northern Italy, and there's a great video on YouTube outlining how he managed to do this. But essentially, the idea is that if you have 3 separate locations that you're trying to compete with the enemy over, rather than spreading your forces really thin across all 3 and perhaps getting outnumbered in all 3 as a result, if you can concentrate and leave tiny amounts of forces, defensive forces, in 2 of those locations, then put the rest into 1 where you can overwhelm the enemy, then you can defeat the enemy at that exact location, and then you can do it again at the other location, and then at the final location. In other words, you can defeat the enemy bit by bit, rather than trying to overwhelm everything all at once. And that's concentration of force. 6, economy of effort. This is very similar, and it basically means that you're not wasting effort. You're not putting a lot of energy, effort, and resources into something that isn't as important. You want to concentrate your material, concentrate your manpower and your time into the right objectives. The 7th is security. Providing and maintaining an operating environment that affords freedom of action. Now that might mean physical security. It means making sure that your bases aren't going to come under attack, making sure that troops in transport to the front aren't going to get ambushed, making sure that your supply lines aren't going to get attacked. But it also means intelligence and counterintelligence. In the modern day, it means cybersecurity too. It's very key. If your security as a military is compromised, then you don't have freedom of action. You aren't able to do what you want to do because the enemy's going to know what you're going to do and they're going to hamper that. 8, flexibility. As I mentioned earlier, it's key. Key to any organization is the ability to quickly adapt to meet new circumstances. You need to be agile, you need to be responsive, resilient, you need to have accuracy, you need to have adaptability. And the way we do that in a military sphere is by keeping things simple, keeping communication flowing, keeping ideas moving, and always keeping an uncommitted reserve who can be deployed to where they're needed if they're needed. If you commit all your forces to a very complicated, very detailed mission, and any one elements of that mission, that plan go wrong, then you're in a world of hurt because you're suddenly committed to something that's not working, you're stuck in a rut, and you're not flexible. You're very solid. So you have a simple plan. We need to get to this location, we need to find the enemy, we need to engage them. And then you empower your commanders to adapt to whatever happens on the ground. They can make the decisions they need to make to achieve that aim. 9, cooperation. The incorporation of teamwork and a sharing not just of ideas, which is typically what we think of cooperation, but sharing danger, sharing burden, sharing risks, sharing opportunities. There's a great story from the last great war of antiquity. And the story goes that when Heraclius, the Byzantine emperor, invaded modern-day Iraq, Mesopotamia, then it was the Persian Empire, he invaded with one army. And he struck right hard into the deep of modern-day Iraq, close to Baghdad, or Ctesiphon as it was back then. And the Persian armies, there were 3 of them following him. Now what happens is the 3 Persian armies were led by 3 nobles, very powerful men, who all competed against one another. They all wanted to impress the Shahanshah, the emperor of emperors. And Heraclius knew this, and he took advantage of this, and he did something very, very clever. He took a group of men from his army, he roughed them up a little bit, make them look like they'd been in a bit of a scrap, and he sent men out in the direction of each of the 3 armies that were following his. And when those men arrived at those 2 Persian armies, they were of course taken prisoner, and when the Persian armies interrogated them, each of the 3, the men, those kind of groups, they told the Persian commanders, yeah, the other Persian army is defeated us, they're wiping us, they're destroying us. And what happened is they made all 3 of those generals think that the other generals were getting all the spoils, and they were getting the victory, they were seizing the opportunity. And so they all rushed to the same location to try and defeat the Byzantine army. And of course, the Byzantine army weren't there. The whole thing was a ruse. He had managed to go to Baghdad while those 3 were fighting amongst themselves over the spoils. And that's an important lesson in sharing opportunities. So to achieve cooperation, you need goodwill. You need everyone moving in the same direction and acting in good faith, wanting to do the right thing, not acting in self-interest. You need to have a common aim, everyone on the same page. We all know what we need to achieve here and we all agree with it. And also importantly, but rather difficult to achieve, you need a clear division of responsibilities. Your job is to do that. Your job is to do this. And you two don't start doing each other's jobs, things get complicated. 10, and last of all, this is the most recent addition to the tactical principles, sustainability. Ensure your fighting power can be maintained over the necessary period of time and across the necessary area. And this requires good administration and logistics, it requires care of equipment, and it requires clever supply chains and things like that. So those are the 10 tactical principles of the British Armed Forces. Those are the fundamental ideas behind how the British military wants to achieve victory in warfare. Select and maintain an aim. Maintain morale. Take offensive action where you can. Maintain security. Take the element of surprise where you can. Use concentration of force and defeat in detail. Use economy of effort. Be flexible. Cooperate. And be sustainable in your operations. Don't try and bite more than you can chew. So this video has looked at 2 introductory topics relating to doctrine, military knowledge and military philosophy. The first was the concept of fighting power, where we looked at what makes a military effective in terms of conceptual, moral and physical components. And then we looked at the tactical principles of the British Armed Forces, which are used as a guide to show the British military what to do and how to operate. I hope you found this interesting. Admittedly, it's theoretical, it's philosophical, and that's not everyone's cup of tea, but I think that there's real wisdom in some of these ideas, and I'm hoping that they provide a really good foundational understanding and pique your interest a little bit to learn more about specific areas of doctrine, such as leadership doctrine and what makes a really effective leader, such as counterinsurgency and specific things like that, air and space warfare, urban combat. There are so many interesting areas of doctrine we can look at. And I hope also that you've thought about how these ideas might be relevant to normal, everyday civilian life and relevant perhaps to your own life. How can you have a good conceptual component? How can you have a good moral component, a good physical component? Think about that. Thank you for listening and tune in next time.